Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is 12 February 2026, years after Jesus. It is a Thursday, and we are in an episode topic that I'm so excited about. This past issue of Claremont Review of Books included an article by a scholar that was on my dissertation committee and was one of my professors at the Ph.D. level. His name is Dr. Joseph Bessette, Joseph M. Bessette. He wrote this book review called Unmasked, and I'm shining it up on the screen. If you're on YouTube, you can see it. I have the hard copy, and I would like to plug this for Claremont Review of Books. I really want you to get the hard copy. I want you to subscribe to Claremont Review of Books. Let me show you what I have in my hand here. This is the latest issue of Claremont Review of Books. As you can see, it's a physical copy, something you can flip through. It's got attractive ads. It's all about books, and it's all about understanding where we're at in terms of American politics, all the different aspects of it, historical, policy, philosophy, law. It's wonderful. There's a little bit of religion and literature, and I'm loving it. So go out and get your copy of Claremont Review of Books today. And the way you go there is you go to ClaremontReviewofBooks.com, I believe. Let me look here. Hold up. Is it .com? Well, yeah, it's ClaremontReviewofBooks.com, and you can sign up. So this is from the fall 2025, winter 2006 edition, and is called Unmasked. And it's a review of a book called In COVID's Wake: How Our Politics Failed Us by Stephen Macedo, who we're covering on the podcast. In a different context, his 1986 book by Cato, published by Cato. So look up that. That's in the Natural Law Constitution playlist on YouTube. And then Francis Lee, it's called In COVID's Wake: How Our Politics Failed Us. So these are two Princeton professors, I believe. And this book review, I'm so excited to share with you, especially since it's written by one of my favorite professors ever, Joseph M. Bessette, who I know personally and who was on my dissertation committee. He was a great professor, hard ass, which I love. I love the fact that he's a hard ass. If you don't have a hard ass on your committee, I'm sorry. You probably don't have a PhD. You might have a PhD in name only, but I love his commitment to excellence. I read this on Monday, 5 January 2026. It's on page 117 of the print edition. Um, so we're going to do a fair use, make a fair use and a transformative reading of this. And it's, guys, I am still censored by the Biden administration on YouTube on this topic. So I'm a little bit hesitant to get into this because the Biden administration used YouTube as a proxy for censorship on this, apparently on this topic, which I didn't really directly cover. It was only side comments that people made that got those videos taken down, and they threatened my entire channel. And you need to know that those videos to this day are still censored. To this day. For political reasons. Now, when they give you the email, they don't say this is about politics. They don't say that. They never say that. They say stuff like this. Well, we need to keep the community safe from the dangerous, whatever it is. And it's like, give me a freaking break. Give me a freaking break. The one sentence that the person said was dangerous, really? And they will look at you with a straight face and say, yeah, really. And what they're really saying is, we have power and we can yank your chain any time we want. So watch it, buddy. Don't talk about what we don't want you to talk about. That's still happening today. Today, 12 February 2026, years after Jesus, I am still, the Republican Professor podcast is still censored by YouTube using Biden era politics. Still to this day. Imagine if they were in power. Holy freaking crap. Wake up. Wake up. And what I'm about to interact with and discuss with you as I read through this thing is incredibly sobering. Stephen Macedo is at Princeton University. I'm really surprised they allow him to exist there. Francis Lee is, let's see where Francis Lee is. Well, I can't remember where Francis Lee is. Sorry. Maybe at Princeton too. Yeah. Princeton. That's in the book review by Joseph M. Bessette. Joseph M. Bessette taught my first PhD course, which was called The Presidency and the Constitution. Excellent course. Excellent. I think I've talked about it on the podcast here and there. Um, I'm not going to talk about it right now because we have a lot to do here. In COVID's wake, How Our Politics Failed Us by Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee is published by Princeton University Press. It's 392 pages, and it's $29.95 if you pay full price. So, like I said, go to ClermontReview-of-Books.com and subscribe today. You'll get a wonderful publication in the mail 4 times a year. I believe it's less than $30 for the year. And if it's even cheaper if you do multi-year at one time. Um, Professor Bessette starts his book review, Claremont Review of Books, Fall 2025, Winter 2026, page 117 in the print edition that I have, the hard copy. He starts it on page 117 saying, in their timely new book, In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us, Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee provide a searing indictment of public pubic health experts. Sorry guys. I'm still upset, guys. I have to admit, I was acting like a child just then because I'm upset that I'm still censored for political reasons on YouTube. And here I am talking about this on YouTube, and I don't know. I don't trust YouTube at all. I know that everybody says, go to Rumble, go to Rumble. I don't like that Democrats mediate our communications with our elected officials. Now, thank God that's not happening on Twitter anymore. Thank God. How's it feel, Democrats? How's it feel? Steve Macedo and Francis Lee provide a searing indictment, okay? And I know it's indictment of public health. And I always think pubic health when I see that because of just how bad we were treated. Oh my gosh, what they did to us. Don't forget, never forget what they did to us. Let's keep going. Okay, I'm just going to go smooth sailing from here, all right? If you're having a frustrating time, I'm sorry. I know you're trying to pay attention. Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee provide a searing indictment of public health experts. I want to barf already. I know I told you it was going to be smooth sailing. And political elites' response to the COVID pandemic that imposed on the American citizenry restrictions, quote, more sweeping and disruptive than any that had been previously contemplated in Western pandemic plans, unquote. Starting in March 2020, these included stay at home orders, mandated mask wearing, and the closure of schools, businesses, and sporting events. The imposition of these non pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, raised three serious questions. First, could they prevent or significantly slow the spread of a highly contagious respiratory virus, at least until a vaccine became widely available? Second, what health, economic, and social costs did these interventions themselves impose? And third, did the costs of the policies outweigh their benefits? So starts Joseph M. Bessette in Unmasked, a book review of In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us by Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee, both Princeton professors. Claremont-Review-of-Books, page 117, winter 2026. Macedo and Lee, longtime political science professors at Princeton University, hold that the answer to the first question is almost certainly no. And what was the answer to the first question? Well, the first question was, could they prevent or significantly slow the spread of a highly contagious respiratory virus, at least until a vaccine became available? I'm just reading it exactly as it's written, okay? All right. Macedo and Lee said the answer is most certainly no. Although governments had never previously been able to stop a respiratory pandemic, public health officials came to embrace a strategy that presupposed the impossible, that the United States could suppress the spread of COVID. This approach ignored the dominant view among public health experts prior to COVID that NPIs, remember that's non-pharmaceutical interventions, were of limited use in responding to a respiratory pandemic. In fact, no Western plans for a respiratory pandemic available at the outset of COVID at the outset of the COVID pandemic recommended sweeping NPIs such as large-scale quarantines, lockdowns, preemptive school closures, and mass testing and contact tracing. I'm going to read that sentence again. No Western plans for a respiratory pandemic available at the outset of the COVID pandemic recommended sweeping NPIs such as large-scale quarantines, lockdowns, preemptive school closures, and mass testing and contact tracing. In COVID's wake, that's, remember, the book being reviewed here, okay? In COVID's wake, early chapters are an account of how and why the experts so quickly reversed themselves on NPIs? The authors emphasize, Joseph M. Bessette continues, my professor, a valued member of my dissertation committee at the Claremont colleges. The authors emphasize how American federalism allowed for significant variation at the state level in COVID policies. In the American system, the states, not the federal government, possess the general police power over health and safety. Okay. If you don't know that term, police power, take a note of it and think about how to clarify your theory of it. You need a theory of the police power. State governments, almost always governors, decided whether to require residents to stay at home or wear masks, and whether to close schools and businesses. Though nearly all adopted these policies, variation across states was considerable. For example, Governor Gavin Newsom of California, the first to impose a stay-at-home order, kept his in place for over 150 days. New Mexico's Governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, kept hers for just under 250 days. Jeez. Lord have mercy on us. Both Democrats. No other state went longer than 100 days, and 7 states issued no such orders at all. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. Wow, 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 wow. Likewise, public school closures, which were universal by March 25th, 2020, lasted only until the summer break in some states and a full year longer in others. Did these NPIs save lives? Not according to the data that Macedo and Lee present. They show that death rates were unaffected by the number of days it took for a state to impose its first stay-at-home order. The number of days the stay-at-home order remained in effect and the number of days that schools were closed. Again, I'm going to read that again. They show that death rates were unaffected by the number of days it took for a state to impose its first stay-at-home order, the number of days the stay-at-home order remained in effect, and the number of days that schools were closed. As for the vaccines, the authors found that states with higher rates of vaccinations had lower rates of COVID deaths. I'm just reading it as it is, okay? Quote, variation in vaccine rates can account for fully 47% of the state by state variation in COVID mortality, unquote. Yeah, you know what I'm talking. You know what I'm thinking. The term COVID deaths, what does that even mean? Is it with or from? Well, so far we don't know, but hang on. Hang on. Hang in there, okay? Hang in there. A later chapter reviews the evidence of the effectiveness of mask wearing, which we've covered on this podcast, at least at the administrative law level when it was struck down by a Trump-appointed judge. We have a whole series on that on the Republican Professor from 2024, I believe it was. In February and March of 2020, such authorities as Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the U.S. Surgeon General, and the World Health Organization all advised against mask wearing by the public to combat the spread of COVID. In the early April, the Washington Post, quote, echoed the pre-COVID conventional wisdom, unquote, and a headline, quote, everyone wore masks during the 1918 flu pandemic. They were useless, unquote. That was a Washington Post headline. In January 2023, after the pandemic had largely run its course, a Cochrane Library study, the gold standard for systematic review of medical research. I gotta turn the page here in the print edition, and while I do this, I want to show you. I'm on page 118. I make little notes as I go, usually in pen. I know I usually say pencil, but when I'm reading this, I usually have a cigar, and I find that pencil doesn't write on this type of high quality magazine paper, so I use pen, and I'm just careful about what I do. I usually I'm putting a check mark or I'm underlining something to go back to later so that it catches my eye while I'm covering it on the podcast. Okay, so I'm on page 118 at the top. Got to start that sentence again now. In January 2023, after the pandemic had largely run its course, a Cochrane Library study, the gold standard for systematic reviews of medical research, now I'm on page 118 at the top in the print edition, found no evidence that masks, including high-quality N95 masks, reduced COVID deaths. And I know you are all thinking, that's a shocker. That's a shocker. Yeah, I know. I agree. I agree. As Macedo and Lee write in their conclusion, became clear to anyone who cared to look that the strategy to contain the spread of the virus was not working. And states and regions with lighter restrictions were not faring systematically worse than those with more stringent restrictions. Yet the public health establishment and national policymakers seemed uninterested in learning from the array of experiments being conducted in the nation's 50 laboratories of democracy. Yeah, why would they be uninterested? That's what you want to really think about here. In this respect, write the authors, COVID pandemic offers a sobering failure of the laboratories of democracy idea. Policymakers should have learned from the state comparisons, but did not. Decision-making about pandemic policy was rigidly ideological and moralized. That's a direct quote. And thus did not pragmatically adjust to new information and experience. This is all very sobering, but it's probably nothing that you don't already know. Am I right or am I right? Though it seems true that national policymakers did not learn much from state-by-state comparisons, it is less clear that this was the case for state policymakers. For example, after California issued a stay-at-home order on March 19th, 2020, 42 other states followed, all by April 7th. But 7, Arkansas, Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming, never issued such an order, even as the virus spread throughout the country. Why did these states refrain from adopting a policy that was embraced by 43 other states? Similarly, why did 9 states rescind their stay-at-home orders by the end of April and another 14 by mid-May? Let's do the math here then. 7 states never issued the order, and then 9 rescinded very quickly by the end of April. 9 plus 7 is 16 out of 50. I'm going to take a drink of water. I need to get a little bit of moisture here. I'm going to mute it. Trying to stay hydrated. Okay. Trying to. All right. So you got 16 states. Then it says another 14 by mid-May, just a couple weeks later, rescinded the stay-at-home orders. So that's 30 states out of 50 had pretty much the right answer. Yeah. So did these states remain unconvinced that stay-at-home orders across the country were slowing the spread of the virus? Was this the laboratories of democracy living up to their promise? Macedo and Lee note that Democratic-leaning states had the most stringent COVID restrictions across the spring, summer, fall, and winter of 2020. That's very refreshing to hear. It's very refreshing. Yeah, just calling it like it is. I mean, it's called political phenomenology, just describing the way it is. What a concept. What a concept. And Republican leaning states had the least stringent restrictions throughout that period. What a concept. Just describing. All you're doing is describing the phenomena. That's all you're doing. Why was this? In general, the authors attribute these policy differences to variations in public opinion in these states, with governors more or less accurately reflecting the views of their citizens. Were Republican citizens and officials more suspicious of government mandates and concomitantly more committed to economic and personal freedom? This may have inclined them to be less ideological and moralistic about COVID policies and thus more open to what could be learned about the effectiveness of government imposed restrictions across the states. Yes, he did just say that. Yes, he did just say that. To what extent, for example, did other Republican governors learn from the success of Florida's Ron DeSantis in pushing back against mask mandates and extensive school and business closures? In a larger sense, in COVID's wake, itself vindicates federalism's laboratories of democracy idea. Imagine looking back at COVID policies dictated entirely by the federal government with, um, as a result, no state by state variations. How much harder would it be to assess whether stay at home orders, school closures, and other COVID restrictions had any effect on deaths due to COVID? I like how he said due to COVID. Thank you. Not with COVID. Don't care about that. Due to. Caused by. Good. Nice. I like it. Thank you. With their state by state data, the authors make a convincing case that NPIs, non pharmaceutical interventions like lockdowns, did not slow the spread of the disease or reduce deaths from it. There is, of course, no guarantee that when the next pandemic hits, we will consult the lessons of COVID to guide our response. But if we do try to learn from the past, we will have no better place to look than the successes and failures of the different states during the COVID crisis of 2020 to 2023. We're continuing in our excellent discussion. Notice I just gave myself a compliment. Let me fix that. We continue in our discussion of, of this excellent book review. As far as I can tell, it's excellent. I haven't read the book, so I think to be able to tell whether it's an excellent book review in full, I would have to read the book and then read the book review. But as far as I can tell, it's excellent in just the sense of not having read the book. It certainly makes me want to read the book. And then you might think, well, that's not necessarily an excellent book review. That's just an excellent advertising for the book. Well, um, fair point. Fair point. I just like this writing, is what I'm trying to say. This essay by Joseph M. Bessette is excellent. Put it that way. Okay. Whether it's an excellent book review remains to be seen, but it's certainly. I know Joseph M. Bessette personally. He was on my dissertation committee. He was one of the best professors I've ever had. When he taught my very first PhD course, which introduced me to the topic of the presidency and the Constitution. And he did such a fantastic job that I still look at it as the gold standard for how to teach material like that. And I myself would teach the material like that if I could to undergrads, but he was doing it with grad students and he was able to push us a lot harder. Undergrads, they just don't know anything. So I I tried and I tried. I was teaching a an international relations course at Azusa Pacific University. I had students in there that didn't know who Richard Nixon was. These are adults who can vote at their in their 20s. They're studying political science. They're taking international relations in college. They didn't already know who Richard Nixon was. Um, and this is in California. Richard Nixon is from California. You guys, we're headed for, I don't like to cuss on this podcast, but we're headed for a shitstorm. I do the best I can, man. And I did not inflate grades. And you know what? Azusa Pacific University, to their great credit, never asked me to inflate grades. I never got any pressure to inflate grades. Unlike LMU, Loyola Marymount University, unlike Pepperdine University, unlike the community colleges. Although my time at the community colleges, it's a little bit more delicate and it's harder to explain the pressure, as it took a different form. The only pressure that I got to inflate grades at Azusa was from the students and their willingness or unwillingness to sign up for your course. And of course, that signals to the school whether they want to retain you, because they only want to retain professors who get students to sign up for the course. And so, I mean, it's this is the game that is played. And sometimes you're not in the mood to play the game that semester for whatever reason. And, maybe you think things are a little too serious. We shouldn't be playing these games anymore. We should be past this. Unfortunately, that's not the way it goes. But more on that later. Let's get back to this. Let's get back to that. All right, I think I'm halfway through page 118 in this excellent essay written by Joseph M. Bessette, Claremont Review of Books, fall 2025, winter 2026, called Unmasked. It would be indictment enough of COVID policymaking if our governments unnecessarily imposed widespread restrictions on human freedom and then failed to modify or end such restrictions when evidence demonstrated their ineffectiveness. But it was worse than this. That's one of the few lines that I have underlined. It was worse than this. For the policies themselves carried undeniable and substantial health, economic, and social costs, costs that were simply ignored by policymakers and public health officials. I think that is probably the most frightening thing I've read in a long time. It goes along with what I was saying about grade inflation and the lowering of academic standards. I mean, this is really basic stuff, guys. Don't ignore costs and cost benefit analysis. I mean, it's right there in the name of the type of analysis it is. Cost benefit. It's human nature, the sin nature, only to look at the benefits if that's what you want and you have an agenda. But the costs are equally a part of a cost benefit analysis. Hello, it's right there in the name of the type of analysis. Hello, to quote my mentor, Michael Uhlman. Hello, that's what he used to do all the time. Hello. But it was worse than this. I'm reading it again. For the policies themselves carried undeniable and substantial health, economic, and social costs. Costs that were simply ignored by policymakers and public health officials. I want you to take a look at this. We're on page 118. Just look at what I underlined right there. They were simply ignored. Democrats. The political phenomenology of this is they're Democrats. The Princeton University Press, they're acknowledging it. They're publishing this. Not just me. From Macedo and Lee. How much more we got? We got quite a bit left. And it only gets better, guys. It only gets better. Don't go anywhere because it only gets better. For Macedo and Lee, one of the most striking features of COVID policy making was this indifference to weighing the expected costs of pandemic control policies against their expected benefits. Life is full of trade-offs, and it seems an elementary point. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It seems an elementary point that when imposing policies to achieve certain social benefits, one must consider the costs imposed by the policies themselves and determine whether the anticipated benefits outweigh the perceived costs. Kind of the point I was just making, is it not? Yeah. Failure to consider both costs and benefits, the authors write, constitutes a fundamental failure of democratic deliberation. Yet in 2020 through 2021, consideration of trade-offs was systematically swept aside, primarily by Democrats, as he's just said. Primarily by Democrats. The public health experts most responsible for directing national COVID policy all embraced an extremely narrow understanding of the policy's purpose. Fauci acknowledged that he did not see it as his job to consider the economic costs or other potential negative consequences of COVID policy. Dr. Deborah Birx, B-I-R-X, who was brought in to coordinate COVID policy at the White House, by the way, Republican, Trump. Trump deserves some blame here. He was the president, for God's sake. During an election year, too. Man, what a disaster. Dr. Deborah Birx, who was brought in to coordinate COVID policy in the White House, saw her job strictly as reducing disease-related fatalities. She simply could not tolerate the notion that even 0.1%, and that's 10% of 1%, of Americans die a preventable death. As the authors put it, and that is, of course, Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee, as the authors put it, under Birx's view, preventable deaths must be prevented regardless of costs. It'd be like asking a transportation engineer to design a highway system with the single goal of reducing deaths from traffic accidents. So much for left turns, speed limits above 30 miles an hour, etc. And Fauci's boss, Francis Collins, oh Lord, have mercy on him, then director of the National Institutes of Health, now admits that he gave no consideration to costs of COVID policies. By the way, there was an excellent um, informed dissent episode that I covered on I covered on my Substack. And so check out the Substack, Republican Professor Substack. You'll see the link to it. Excellent informed dissent interview with Jay Bhattacharya, who's now the NIH director. And it's a tale of two Christians, Jay and Francis, and which Christian is a Democrat, which Christian is a Republican appointee. And the Republican Christian is much more sensitive to evidence and common sense. And like, for example, considering costs and cost benefit analysis. Yeah, and what Joseph M. Bessette calls an elementary point. That's an elementary point. What Macedo and Lee call a fundamental failure. Yeah, the Republican appointee, Jay Bhattacharya, avoided that criticism, whereas Francis Collins, the Democrat Christian appointee, yeah, went right into it. He flew at 1,000 miles an hour right into that criticism. Fauci's boss, Francis Collins, then director of the National Institutes of Health, NIH, now admits that he gave no consideration to the costs of COVID policies. As he said in 2023, of the public health mindset that he embraced, quote, you attach infinite value to stopping the disease and saving a life. You attach a zero value to whether this actually totally disrupts people's lives, ruins the economy, and has many kids swept out of schools in the way they never quite recover from, unquote. It's scarcely believable, Joseph M. Bessette continues, that the person at the top of the $45 billion agency devoted to promoting the nation's public health could hold such a view. Wow. Well said, Professor Bessette. Well said. If this were not bad enough, the media and academics joined the public health establishment in ignoring or denying the collateral costs of COVID policies. And I will go one further to that. YouTube, to this day, enforces the Biden administration policies censoring discussion of exactly this stuff. Apple Podcasts never did censor it, so you can go on there and you can listen to my conversation with Heidi St. John, spring 2022, and my conversation with Lance Wallnow, spring 2022. Both of those videos are to this day taken down from YouTube for political reasons. Now, when they said, here's why we're taking it down, they made it sound like I was some kind of eco-terrorists and they were protecting the community from me. You listen to yourself and tell me what was dangerous. They're censoring discussion of the costs. And as you can see when you listen to those, it's a very mild discussion. I mean, it's like someone just says something off the cuff and it gets censored. And they're censored to this day, right now, still by Democrat YouTube. Yeah. If this were not bad enough, the media and academics joined the public health establishment in ignoring or denying the collateral costs of COVID policies. And indeed, the costs of COVID policies, including costs to physical and mental health, were considerable. Among others recounted by Macedo and Lee, cancer screening declined drastically, excess deaths from heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, overdose, and homicide all rose. Obesity increased, especially in children. Anxiety, depression, and eating disorders all increased, as did pediatric emergency department visits for self-harm, suicidal ideation, and attempted suicide. Substance abuse rose, and people in nursing homes and long-term care facilities were deprived of meaningful human connections, personal well-being, and quality of life. Yeah, that right there is deserving of hell. And I'm sure, I'm sure there's some people going to hell here. I'm sure of it. And I'm just going to double down on that because on the Christian view of things, we're all going to hell unless you acknowledge the Lord Jesus as your Savior and ask for forgiveness and repent of your sins. You acknowledge Him as Lord. But yeah, this is the kind of sin that sends you to hell without Christ. Lord, have mercy. Yeah. Yeah. All those old people dying without human connection. One might think, continues Joseph M. Bessette on page 118 of the print edition, one might think that public health professionals would care about such costs and not assign them a value of zero. You would think. It's quite frightening to me that this had to be written. And this is one of the few things that I've underlined here. One would think. The authors report that in May 2020, COVID task forces advising decision makers in 24 countries had mainly virologists and epidemiologists, but largely no specialists in the areas such as mental health, child health, chronic diseases, preventative medicine, gerontology, not to mention experts in non-health spheres. What then of the non-health costs imposed by COVID policies? Congress authorized $5 trillion in new spending, with most of it going to compensate individuals and businesses for the income lost by COVID policy restrictions. What a freaking disaster. The massive aid packages, together with the disruptions in supply of goods, led to sharply elevated levels of inflation, a dramatic reversal of the low inflation. Yeah, it was a great economy. I remember it. The low inflation. We're now on page 119, and it's a little bit hard to see this, so I'm going to have to hold it like this here. Okay. Um, uh, Massive aid packages, together with disruption in supply of goods, led to sharply elevated levels of inflation, a dramatic reversal of the low inflation environment prevailing for many years before 2020. Businesses closed and unemployment skyrocketed. What could possibly go wrong? Businesses closed and unemployment skyrocketed, especially harming low wage service sector workers. More broadly, nearly every aspect of the pandemic response inflicted greater harms on economically disadvantaged people. For the first time in American history, public schools were closed wholesale in an effort to preempt the spread of a novel infection. It is hardly surprising that school closures resulted in major declines in student learning. Even more, after schools reopened, there was a doubling of chronic absenteeism from school. Yeah. Macedo and Lee conclude their summary of the costs of COVID policies with a poignant paragraph about the sheer reality of lost time. Yeah. This is a block quote from the book. Quote, the time lost with aging parents and grandparents, including holidays in 2020, the last Thanksgiving or Christmas for many, lost ceremonies and commemorations, graduation 2020, Zoom retirement parties, canceled school plays, lost sports seasons for young athletes who will never get those youthful days back, lost connections, new friends that students would have made in person, lost loves never met in chance encounters, foregone travel, even teleworkers. Members of the laptop class lost connections with work colleagues, collaborations that never happened, new ideas no one ever had because the conversation that would have sparked them never took place. The policy response to the COVID pandemic reshaped lives. Indeed, it reshaped all of our lives, often in profound ways, unquote. It might not have been possible for decision makers to factor in the costs associated with lost time. The same cannot be said about the massive new federal spending and the inflation it engendered, the business closures and job losses that affected those not fortunate enough to be able to work from home, and the steep declines in student learning. Yet consideration of these costs, as well as the physical and mental health costs outlined above, played no role at all in formulating the government's COVID policies. I'm going to read that again. Yet consideration of these costs and a health cost benefit analysis. Yet consideration of these costs, as well as the general as sorry, yet consideration of these costs, as well as the physical and mental health costs outlined above, played no role in at all in formulating the government's COVID policies. What is especially dismaying is that that pre-pandemic planning in the public health community had correctly anticipated many of the costs and ethical dilemmas that emerged during the COVID pandemic response. Yeah. Let me see if I can hold on a sec. Trying to reduce. There we go. Why was it up at why was it so high? It seems like it was at 240. Well, anyway, I was trying to get a smaller look at the book, but I guess I don't really know what I'm doing. Anyway, let's continue. I'm sure that this is fascinating for you. And if not, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say, man. This is hard for me to read. It's also very validating, though. Where was I? Played no role. What is especially dismaying, I'm on the left-hand side of page 119, print edition. What is especially dismaying is that pre-pandemic planning in the public health community had correctly anticipated many of the costs and ethical dilemmas that emerged during COVID pandemic response. COVID policymaking, Macedo and Lee aver, was nothing less than a failure of democratic deliberation. One might think that the authors would end their account here. Instead, in their final chapters, they warn of deeper pathologies in American democracy that the COVID crisis revealed and that portend serious problems in the future. One is the politicization of science. Macedo and Lee described the efforts by leading scientists in February and March 2020, including Dr. Fauci, to deceive the public into believing that the virus must have come from natural processes involving a jump from bats to humans through some intermediary species sold at the Wuhan seafood market. Yet from the very beginning, key scientists believed that the evidence supported an alternative theory that the virus, originally from bats, had been manipulated in the Wuhan Institute of Virology to be able to infect humans and had accidentally leaked from the lab. Such a gain of function research, though highly controversial, was defended as a proactive measure to allow scientists to develop vaccines in advance of a possible epidemic. Macedo and Lee show through the growing public record of communications among key players that scientists intentionally distorted what was known about the virus and managed to relegate the lab leak hypothesis to conspiracy theory status. Why would scientists do this? Excellent question. In COVID's wake suggests two possible reasons. First, some apparently believed that if the virus were known to have been manipulated at a Chinese lab, a major international incident might result, up to and including war. Others may have lacked faith in President Trump's ability to manage such a crisis. And there were genuine fears that the Chinese government, if found to have tolerated unsafe conditions at the Wuhan lab, might refuse to cooperate with the international scientific community. But Macedo and Lee insist that even if these judgments were sound, these were not, however, scientific judgments. Oh, scientific judgments. I forget. The C is silent. Yeah, those are not scientific judgments. Censorship is not a scientific judgment. Yeah. Lying is not a scientific judgment. Emphasis original. So he's quoting Macedo and Lee, but rather political judgments to be made by public officials. Is it consistent with the governing principles of democracy or science, they ask, to entrust scientists in closed and secretive sessions to make such policy judgments unilaterally? We think not. The authors, and I need to say something here. The NIH director is a political appointee, confirmed by the US Senate, nominated by the president. Uh, It's political. Now, is it scientific? Okay, maybe, but it's a political appointment. You might wonder what science and politics has to do with it. Well, it's politics. It is politics. The failure here was accountability from the top down. The president is the executive power. The president is responsible for that. Anything that Congress does to try to impede the responsibility of the president over these executive branch agencies is illegitimate, in my view. The buck has to stop with the president. Now, I know that Congress funds these suckers, so there's lots of games that get played here. And I don't know if even Congress is doing its job, whatever that means. But politics is all over science. Of course. Why? Because money is all over science. And politics and money go hand in hand, especially when it's public money. The authors also show that less high-minded motivations were likely at work. Consider Dr. Christian Anderson of the Scripps Institute in San Diego. In late 2020, when the novel virus first became known to American scientists, Anderson believed that it had properties that may have been genetically modified or engineered. A few days later, he wrote to Fauci that he and three other scientists believed the virus looked engineered and found the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. According to the testimony he later gave to Congress, Anderson repeated his concerns in a conference call with American and European virologists on February 1st. 3 days later, he wrote to a colleague that, quote, the lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work and the molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario, unquote. Yet within weeks, Anderson was the lead author of a now famous proximal origin paper published online in February and then in final form in Nature Medicine in mid-March. It concluded that, quote, our analysis clearly shows that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or purposely manipulated virus, unquote. At a press conference, Anderson said, quote, we can firmly determine that SARS-CoV-2 originated through natural processes, unquote. We now know that just days before the paper went online, Anderson had emailed the senior editor at Nature that he and his colleague could not refute a lab origin and possibility must be considered as serious scientific theory. The proximal origin paper was highly influential in shaping the narrative around COVID's origin. By July 2023, it had been accessed nearly 6 million times. Macedo and Lee hold that the paper misrepresented, apparently intentionally, the state of the science, that the, quote, headline grabbing claims in the article are not supported by evidence presented in it, unquote. Later, the authors cite congressional testimony from 2024 by Professor Richard H. Ebright, the head of a research laboratory at Rutgers University, who concluded that there was an, quote, extremely strong case, unquote, that the COVID virus had, quote, a research-related origin, unquote, and that there was, quote, compelling evidence, unquote, that the, quote, proximal origin, unquote, paper was, quote, a product of scientific misconduct up to and including scientific fraud, unquote. Fauci, Collins, and others trumpeted the paper's findings as settling the issue of the origins of the virus. The chief editor of Nature Medicine, urged others to put aside conspiracy theories about the virus's origins and to stop spreading, quote, misinformation, unquote. Within a few weeks, the authors write, Anderson's lab received a $1.9 million grant from Fauci's NIAID. Although peer review of the grant application had been completed months earlier, final approval was pending as Fauci and Collins oversaw the effort of Anderson and his co-authors to deflect responsibility from the lab that NIH and NIAID were helping to fund. This points to, quote, the vast power wielded by Collins, Fauci, Dr. Jeremy Farrar, and I'm turning the page in the hard copy. Okay. Listen to that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fun for the whole family. We're on page 120 now. Editor of the is it editor? Hold up. Yeah, director of the Wellcome Trust in London. And the agencies they headed as the world's mega funders of health related research. It is hard to make sense of Anderson's contradictory positions during his first month during this first month after COVID became known to US scientists unless he felt some great pressure to conform to Collins and Fauci's preferred natural origins hypothesis. It is reasonable to believe that a $1.9 million government grant would constitute such pressure. Yeah, I think that's probably pretty safe to say. I would say that's a pretty safe assumption. But why would it matter to Fauci in particular, especially so early in the pandemic, whether the virus was produced by nature or by a researcher in a lab? Why indeed? Why indeed? Yeah, why? Why? This is so creepy, man. It's just so creepy. I can't even stand it. It's so creepy, dude. I mean, I'm so bummed out, dude. Macedo and Lee show that Fauci had long supported gain of function research of the sort done by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He had even co authored an op ed with Collins and another virologist from NIAID in the Washington Post in 2011 that defended gain of function research. Awkward, awkward, awkward. So awkward. Though the op ed did not use the term it explicitly endorsed generating a potentially dangerous virus in the laboratory if this could be done safely and help researchers develop vaccines or other countermeasures in advance of possible natural evolution of the virus. As the title of the op-ed announced, this was a risk worth taking. More importantly, Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease funded gain-of-function research in the Wuhan lab through grants to the EcoHealth Alliance, which used the Wuhan Institute as a subcontractor. If Fauci had forgotten that fact in the early weeks of the pandemic, he was reminded of it by one of his top staffers in a memo on January 27th, 2020, 2 hours before he was to appear at a White House news conference, and just days before initiating the conference call that led to the writing of Proximal Origin and what now appear to be efforts to suppress open inquiry concerning COVID's possible lab origins. Yet in congressional testimony and other public statements, Fauci has adamantly denied that his agency funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab. Most memorably, he did so in a widely viewed and fiery confrontation with Senator Rand Paul in Senate hearings. Fauci seems to have made up his own definition of gain-of-function in congressional testimony in May 2024. The principal deputy director of NIH confirmed the standard definition that research was gain of function if it involves, quote, enhanced pathogenicity. Let me try that again. Enhanced genetics. Why can't I say that word? Pathogenicity. 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 Okay. And or transmissibility of the virus, enhanced pathogenicity and transmissibility of the virus. But Fauci claims that research is gain of function only if it is likely highly transmissible and capable of wide and uncontrollable spread among humans and is highly virulent or deadly. In other words, writes Macedo and Lee, only the worst imaginable killer viruses count. Fauci, of course, had powerful reasons for engaging in such deception, for the reputations of Fauci, Collins, and others were very much on the line should the COVID pandemic be found to have spilled over from gain-of-function research. When Fauci left government at the end of 2022, he retired to media acclaim from the same news outlets that stigmatized the lab leak theory as a conspiracy theory and that have not yet, as this book goes to press, adequately investigated the question or their own previous handling of it. I'm not saying quote and unquote every single time because it would just be too much. You probably got sick of it when I was doing it earlier. Perhaps news outlets are now coming to grips with the massive public deception perpetuated by scientists about COVID's origins and their own complicity in it. In March 2025, the New York Times ran a lengthy opinion piece by frequent contributor and Princeton professor Zeynep Tufekci. I can't say that last name. The first name is Zeynep. The last name is Tufekci. Is it Turkish? I don't know. Under the title, "We Were Badly Misled About the Event That Changed Our Lives." Oh, Lord, have mercy. These Democrats are the worst, man. These Democrats are the worst. They're the worst. Is there going to be any accountability? I mean, real accountability. This is a good step, but like, seriously, I can't say his name. I'm not sure how to say it. Tufekci? I don't know how to say it. I'm sorry. Under the title, we were badly misled about the event that changed our lives, and relying on information that had come to light through congressional investigations, leaks, and Freedom of Information requests, Tufekci recounts how some officials and scientists hid or understated crucial facts, misled at least one reporter, um, orchestrated campaigns of supposedly independent voices, and even compared notes about how to hide their communications in order to keep the public from hearing the whole story. On the last point, she reports that David Morens, a senior scientific advisor to Fauci at the National Institutes of Health, wrote to Peter Daszak, Daszak, president of the EcoHealth Alliance, that he had learned how to make emails disappear, especially emails about pandemic origins. We're all smart enough to know to never have smoking guns. And if we did, we wouldn't put them in emails. And if we found them, we'd delete them, he wrote. Not only did public health officials and prominent scientists suppress evidence of a lab leak and grossly overstate the case for a natural origin, they and others treated those who speculated about a leak from the Wuhan lab as, quote, kooks, Kooks, and cranks, and conspiracists. Tufekci agrees with the current assessments of the CIA, FBI, and Department of Energy that a lab leak was the likely origin of the COVID pandemic. She reports that German officials had reached a similar conclusion very early on, and she asks a highly pertinent question. Quote, why did it take until now for the German public and the world to learn that way back in 2020, their Federal Intelligence Service endorsed a lab leak origin with 80 to 95% probability? What else is still being kept from us about the pandemic that half a decade ago changed all of our lives? Unquote. Tufekci's purpose is not simply to help to correct the historical record, but to call attention to the dangers of the kind of research conducted at the Wuhan lab. She reports the lab did not employ, quote, the very highest safety protocols, unquote, protocols that, according to two experts on coronaviruses, she quotes, are insufficient for work with potentially dangerous respiratory viruses. She concludes that if the COVID pandemic resulted from a lab leak, that would mean two out of the last 4 or 5 pandemics were caused by our own scientific mishaps. Damn. I got to take a drink of water. I'm going to mute it real quick. We're back. We're continuing Joseph M. Bessette's wonderful essay here. The campaign of public deception about COVID's origin had the effect of deflecting public and government attention away from the dangers of gain-of-function research. Scientists circled the wagons around the EcoHealth Alliance in 2020 when, after it lost a grant to conduct research into bat viruses at the Wuhan Institute, no fewer than 77 Nobel laureates and 31 scientific societies lined up to defend the organization. Pretty scary, dude. Pretty scary. Here's how the New York Times covered the story on May 21st, 2020. Quote, the group EcoHealth Alliance collaborated with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which had been at the center of conspiracy theories about how the novel coronavirus originated. Virologists and intelligence agencies agree that the virus evolved in nature and spread from animals to humans, unquote. Well, convincingly, as in COVID's wake convincingly demonstrates, scientists in January and February of 2020 certainly did not agree that the virus evolved from nature rather than accidentally emerging from the Wuhan lab. The Times coverage is testimony to the effectiveness of the secret campaign by the nation's highest public health officials and scientists in league with them to allow only one possible explanation for the origins of the virus by labeling the alternative a quote conspiracy theory unquote. The New York Times and myriad other news, and now we're on page 120 of the print edition of Claremont Review of Books, winter 2026. Go out and get your copy today. Seriously, get a copy of this. Get this in the mail. Go to ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com and subscribe. It's not that expensive, and you get high quality discussion of what people are talking about. I would not know about this book maybe for years had I not, if I hadn't signed up for this. I highly recommend you do. It enriches my life tremendously. That's why I'm telling you about it. Okay. Support Claremont Review of Books. Please get your copy today. Okay, so I'm on page 121 of the print edition. And we're going to continue here. Okay. So by labeling the alternative a conspiracy theory, the New York Times and myriad other news organizations saw to it that no other explanation would be tolerated in the public sphere. What's more, the larger scientific and academic establishment would not tolerate dissent on either the origins of the virus or the restrictive policies imposed to confront it. This is illustrated by the reaction of Collins, Fauci, and others to the Great Barrington Declaration of October 2020, and by the efforts of Stanford University faculty to censure Dr. Scott Atlas, MD, of Stanford's Hoover Institution. The two cases are now well known and ably recounted by Macedo and Lee. In the first case, three distinguished academics with highly relevant expertise, Dr. Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, Dr. Gupta of Oxford and Dr. J. Bhattacharya of Stanford met in the town of Great Barrington in western Massachusetts and formulated a recommendation, which they published online on October 4th, to alter prevailing COVID policies by focusing protection on the elderly and the most vulnerable while allowing businesses, sporting events, and schools to open. Current lockdown policies, they insisted, are producing devastating effects on short and long-term public health, leading to greater excess mortality in years to come. That was a quote. Eventually, thousands of medical and public health scientists signed the declaration, as did nearly 50,000 medical practitioners. After his nomination by President Trump, and confirmation by the Senate, Bhattacharya became the director of NIH on April 1st, 2025. That is, praise God. That's what I have. Praise God. What a turnaround of events. That's an answer to prayer right there, buddy. Back at NIH, the reaction was immediate. Within days of the declaration's publication, that's the Great Barrington Declaration during the fall of 2020, Director Collins emailed Fauci and others denouncing it as the product of three fringe epidemiologists, though, as he acknowledged, it was also co-signed by Nobel Prize winner Mike Leavitt at Stanford, and urging a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. Denunciations of the Great Barrington Declaration promptly appeared in Wired and The Nation, both left wing, and later written by Greg Consalves, an associate professor of epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health. Oddly, just 6 months earlier, Consalves had rallied more than 800 public health scholars and scientists to sign an open letter warning of the costs of lockdowns, school closures, and travel bans. One of the recurring themes of In COVID's Wake is how quickly, this is a very interesting point right here. One of the recurring themes of In COVID's Wake is how quickly and radically public health officials and other scientists reversed their positions on both purely scientific questions, such as the origin of the COVID virus, and the larger public policy issues about how best to respond to the pandemic. Other denunciations of the Great Barrington Declaration soon followed. For Collins, then, it wasn't enough to assign a value of 0. It wasn't enough to assign a value of 0 to the costs. What a concept. What a concept. For Collins, then, it wasn't enough to assign a value of 0 to the health and other deleterious effects of COVID policies. It was necessary also to shut down any dissent at all, and certainly any larger public debate on COVID policies. To the best of my knowledge, Collins never denied the charge in the Great Barrington Declaration that the shutdown policies had resulted in lower childhood vaccination rates, worsening cardiovascular disease outcomes, fewer cancer screenings, and deteriorating mental health, not to mention the economic, educational, and social effects of closing businesses, schools, and sporting events. Whether these effects were real, whether they were substantial, and whether or not they might outweigh the benefits of shutdowns, none of this was to be debated. None of it was to be even debated. We're finishing page 121 of the print edition. We got one more page left. The case of Dr. Atlas is a chilling example of academic suppression of dissent on COVID policies. A fellow, I hope he was a fellow. What you mean, as opposed to a girl, a chick? Oh, sorry. That's a name of a position. A fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Atlas specializes in radiology and is the author of 5 books on healthcare policy. In late April 2020, Atlas published an opinion piece in The Hill that challenged lockdown policies. Turning the page, doing a Rush Limbaugh thing. We're on page 122, and this is the final page. On many of the same grounds later derailed in the Great Barrington Declaration. He reiterated these points in appearances on Fox News. President Trump brought him into the White House as an advisor in July 2020, where he served through November 2020. And in case you're wondering, Hoover Institution is named after a Republican. It's Republican friendly. Soon after Atlas went to the White House, a campaign began to discredit him. 99 Stanford University professors of epidemiology, immunology, and public health published an open letter condemning their colleague. That sounds right. That sounds about right. Sounds how they work. That's how they operate. They claimed that many of his opinions and statements run counter to established science and that he had undermined public health authorities. And that he had spread falsehoods and misrepresentations of science. Well, interesting. Strikingly, the page-and-a-half letter cited none of Atlas's writings or statements or any scientific research. Macedo and Lee report that after the letter appeared, Dr. Martin Kulldorff offered to debate any of the signatories, but had no takers. That was the Harvard guy, one of the 3 Great Barrington guys. Then, in November, the Stanford University Faculty Senate voted to censure Atlas for advocating a view of COVID-19 that contradicts medical science. According to the Stanford Review, November 25th, 2024, Atlas had been given no opportunity to defend his positions before the censure was issued. And it sounds like a due process violation to me. And in November 2024, even as evidence mounted supporting many of Atlas's positions, the Faculty Senate voted against repealing its 2020 censure. That's a shocker. Macedo and Lee charge Atlas's Stanford critics with 2 offenses: refusing to engage on the point that anti-COVID policies entailed harms of their own, number 1, thus begging all the relevant questions, number 2, and seeming to hold that pandemic policy should be made by people with narrow scientific expertise. For the authors, the latter position is nothing less than absurd. Such experts should inform decision makers, but their expertise is far too narrow to provide a sound basis for policy affecting the whole of society. Scientific experts are in no position to assess the complex array of value judgments and trade-offs across alternatives numerous social and economic considerations, and highly uncertain predictions about human behavior. Even more ominous than academics censoring their own for deviating from the approved party line was government activity urging social media companies to censure opposition to official policy. In COVID's wake, highlights extraordinary restrictions on free speech that came with the mobilization against COVID. Yeah, yep. Hold on one second. I want to show you something. Recording in progress. Okay, now, those of you listening on Apple Podcasts will not be able to see on audio only platforms what I'm doing, but if you go to the video, you can see what I'm doing here. I'm showing you the back end of UBoob, okay? And I want you to see this, okay? Here's the back end. I'm going to show you the censorship that the Republican professor now has. Now, okay, so there's the last one I did, Chevron deference. I don't know if you can see. Let me make it bigger. I guess maybe that's not easy to do, but I'm just going to do the date here. I can just, there's the first episode there on YouTube, February 7th, 2022. Okay. I'm just going to scroll down because very quickly we're going to come to Heidi St. John and we're going to come to uh, the censored ones. Okay. I could just search for it, but I want you to see what it looks like. You see restrictions here? None. Okay, now all of a sudden you have removed. Only I can see this video. It had 236 views before it was removed. It's episode 13, The News Soaked in Prayer, Lance Wallnau Sr. Terms and Policies. This video has been removed because of inappropriate content. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. It's still censored. And this is exactly related to what we've been talking about. Biden era censorship is continuing now. I should say Collins era censorship because Collins was appointed by Barack Obama, not President Trump. That was Fauci's boss. He he could have fired Fauci, but he didn't. It was Democrats in charge of the public health establishment. Of course, the president was in charge of them, and Trump, I think Trump did not know enough. And now that's why you see what he's doing now. You see he wants more of a handle on the administrative state. Now that's Lance Wallnau, April 22nd, 2022. It's still up on Apple Podcasts. You can take a look at it. It's still up. You can listen to it. You tell me what was inappropriate about it. And look here, Heidi St. John, removed. You see that? It still says removed. It had 61 views before it was removed. It was published on May 5th, 2022. Still to this day, I'm censored. The Republican professor is censored because of Democrats on this issue. So when I'm reading this, yeah, it's ominous, dude. This is freaking ominous. Because if you get 3 strikes, they can take your entire channel down. Those are strikes. Removing those videos are strikes. 1, 2. I was 1 strike away from having my channel removed because I had already had one removed. Brad Cummings. They ended up putting that back up for some reason. I don't know why. He said the word. I think he said the word fraud or something, referring to. He didn't say which year. He didn't say which um, event. Oh, I'm afraid to even say what it is now because, I mean, seriously, he said it like it was a 3-hour conversation. He said it like within five, it was a 5 second comment, and they took the entire 3 hours down and a strike against the video, against the channel. They give you a warning first. It was a warning. And then I got 2 strikes. And they were threatening to pull the entire channel down. It's sickening. It's so sickening. How are we supposed to make it, guys, if we can't even talk? Huh? How are we supposed to make it? Even more ominous than academics censoring their own for deviating from the approved party line was government actively urging social media companies to censure opposition to official policy. Wow. In COVID's wake highlights extraordinary restrictions on free speech that came with the mobilization against COVID. Recall, you guys recall a bracing comment. Recall, where was it? On page 119 in the print edition, left-hand side top. For the first time in American history, I have that underlined. Public schools were closed wholesale in an effort to preempt the spread of a novel infection. Okay, this is what I'm talking about is you have such a basic lack of critical thinking skills, and then that in turn is leading to policies to further damage critical thinking skills. You see how it's a snowball effect? And I'm not even saying the schools are doing that good of a job. At, but at least it's something for many kids. There's some good schools out there, some. And when you crack down on free speech and debate, you can't come back from that. That's what all tyrannies do. All tyrannies do, without exception. They also go after arms. And the Democrats are clear. They have told you what they are. They're clear on both. They're clear. In COVID's wake highlights extraordinary restrictions on free speech that came with the mobilization against COVID. Creepy, 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 creepy. Wow. Creepy, creepy, creepy. So extensive were these restrictions that in the summer of 2023, a federal judge characterized this effort as the biggest campaign of government censorship in U.S. history. I've got a note to myself, which federal judge was this? I still don't know the answer to that. I really should. I don't know why I haven't. Joe, why didn't you put that in there? Joseph Bessette. Which judge was that? Through disclosures in a court case brought by Kuldorf and Bhattacharya, we now know that the White House, the Centers for Disease Control, the FBI, and other federal agencies were deeply involved in social media censorship activities. That's not the Trump White House, that's the Biden White House. No opposition was beyond the reach of the censors. At one point, YouTube removed a video of an official public hearing in Florida where Governor DeSantis and the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration discussed COVID policies. YouTube removed that video. You see what I'm saying? I mean, they did that to Ron DeSantis and the officials discussing the policies. Well, why would they not do it with, why would they not? Why would they not do it to some little guy like me? Why would they not? Why would they not? What harm am I doing? I'm just trying to increase critical thinking. What's wrong with that? Satanic, man. I think it's satanic. You have to believe in the supernatural world to understand my point there. No opposition was beyond the reach of the censors. At one point, YouTube removed a video of an official public hearing in Florida where Governor DeSantis and the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration discussed COVID policies. Another platform even removed a video of counsel for the state of Louisiana complaining about being censored. So they remove the original material and then you can't talk about it because they'll remove any discussion of the censorship. And if you have one strike left, how can you that as soon as you're gone, people quickly forget you ever were. And the people that never discovered you will never know what they're missing. It's just like people who never had guns. They don't understand what you're missing if you don't have a Second Amendment. If you never had it, what do you have to compare it with? You never had it. You didn't know it was possible. You don't know what you really deserve as a citizen, as a free person. At one point, YouTube removed a video of an official public hearing in Florida where Governor DeSantis and the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration discussed COVID policies. Rob McCoy had a wonderful YouTube video where he talked through his decisions regarding the church opening and stuff like that, had MDs on and mentioned my grandpa several times, which is why I followed it, to be honest with you. And the whole channel was taken down. Another platform even removed a video of counsel for the state of Louisiana complaining about being censored. Remarkably, the federal government was urging the private sector to censor deliberations by state and local governments about COVID policies that were mainly the province of those state and local governments. This is wrong in so many ways. And it was Democrats. It was Democrats doing this to Republican views. In an incident reported by journalist Matt Taibbi in March 2023, not covered in COVID's wake, something called the Stanford University Internet Observatory urged social media companies to suppress true content which might promote vaccine hesitancy. Might, such as viral posts of individuals expressing vaccine hesitancy or stories of true vaccine side effects. Yeah, the one I was talking about there that is still censored to this day on the channel, and I'm showing it right now on the screen. Heidi St. John, see, removed. Terms and policies. She just discussed how her father died, and her father really did die. And she told a true story. You can hear it on Apple Podcasts because YouTube still, to this day, February 12th, 2026 years after Jesus, Thursday, still will not let you see that. May 5th, 2022. Look it up on Apple Podcasts. You can't see it on Vimeo either. I uploaded to Vimeo. Vimeo canceled my account. It's on Rumble. You can see it on Rumble. I'm not aware of a comparable example in the history of the country of an arm of an American college or university expressly calling for the suppression of truth in the public sphere. That's Joe Bessette's language there in his wonderful essay here, page 122 in the print edition. Thank you, Joe, for writing this, Professor Bessette. Wonderful professor. Go out and support Claremont Review Books, ClaremontReviewBooks.com. Sign up today. Send them $30 and they're going to send you this sucker in the mail. It's worth it, man. It's worth it. I am not aware of a comparable example in the history of the country of an arm of an American college or university expressly calling for the suppression of truth in the public sphere. Stanford's Internet Observatory, it may be hard to believe, titles its periodical publication, this is so Orwellian, Journal of Online Trust and Safety. This is creepy as hell. As if suppressing the truth on social media will enhance public trust in the truth of content of social media. Perhaps most alarming to the authors, as it should be to all of us, is the authoritarian technocracy that the COVID episode portends for our future. The COVID crisis, Macedo and Lee conclude, revealed a troubling alignment of the scientific establishment and political elites to employ technology to prevent the proliferation of error as they defined it under an always shifting definition of truth. These elites have even come up with 3 new terms to describe information or views with which they disagree. Quote, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, unquote. Indeed, write the authors, one need not be George Orwell to find suspicious the proliferation of new terms for what is, essentially, erroneous information. Or it could be just disagreement. Increasingly, educated elites have come to believe that social and political institutions need greater control of information to combat error. In a word, the people must be shielded from exposure to error as defined by their betters. One way to do this is to discipline physicians who spread COVID misinformation, as called for in an article that appeared in August 2023 in a journal of the American Medical Association. The article identified 5 examples of COVID misinformation. A, that the virus originated in a lab in China. B, that government officials withheld COVID information from the public. C, that the effectiveness of masks was doubtful. D, D as in boy. No, just kidding. D as in dog. That natural infection and recovery were as effective in contributing to herd immunity as vaccines. And E, that's E as in cat. Just kidding. E as in Ernie. And E, that government officials pressured social media companies to censor COVID related information. All of which, all of which Macedo and Lee claim may actually be correct or, at minimum, within the scope of reasonable disagreement. And they all are correct, as far as I can tell. More pointedly, most of the 5 statements were almost certainly true. That's Joseph Bessette saying it. Macedo won't say it. Joe Bessette definitely is saying it. So, as with Stanford's Internet Observatory, no statements that challenge the orthodoxy, even if true, perhaps especially if true, were to be allowed. And in this case, violations might bring career-ending reprisals for doctors who challenged the orthodoxy. We're almost done. In some, right, Macedo and Lee, COVID policy furnished a window onto trends in scientific and journalistic practices and public culture more broadly that need far more critical attention. You think? You think? Most troubling is the fact that elites now assert the need for control over the spread of misinformation. It would have been worse if the Democrats had won the White House in 2024. Way worse. But the authors insist placing unchecked power to define error in the hands of elites in government and scientific establishment would be a grave error incomparable with liberalism. Incompatible with liberalism, science, and democratic self-government. Within COVID's wake, Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee have written a brave and wise book about scientific misbehavior, the utter failure of officials to consider the impacts of their policies on the American public, the manipulation of public opinion by stoking fear and censoring opposing views, and the complicity of the media and the academy, and the corruption of public deliberation. Wow. The nation paid a high price for this dysfunction, but it may pay an even greater one in the future if the dangerous trends revealed during the COVID crisis go unchallenged. And that's how Joseph Bessette ends his essay. Joseph M. Bessette is the Alice Tweed Toohey Professor Emeritus of Government and Ethics at Claremont-McKenna College. And he's most famous probably for being on my dissertation committee at the Claremont colleges when I got my Ph.D. in public law and American politics at the Claremont colleges. We've been interacting with this excellent essay in the Claremont Review of Books, Fall 25, Winter 2026, Claremont Review of Books, called Unmasked by Joseph M. Bessette, pages 117 through 122 in the print edition. And Claremont Review of Books is available for subscribers, and it's very easy to subscribe. You just go to ClaremontReviewofBooks.com and put in your information, and I think it's like $30, and you get 4 times a year, once a quarter, a very attractive publication in the mail with very insightful and helpful commentary on books and culture, philosophy, economics, law, that will serve you very well as you grow your intellect, your soul, your mind, and your conversational abilities at a high level, high as required by our form of government. We're guaranteed a Republican form of government in the Constitution, but we're not guaranteed that the average citizen lives up to his or her responsibility that such a government implies. Thanks for joining me on The Republican Professor on this somber Thursday, 12 February 2020, 6 years after Jesus. It's a Thursday. God bless you guys. See you next time.